He stood on a bell tower, the color of old bone. The town of shattered roofs and blackened chimneys spread like a map at his feet. The glass of his scope fogged with his breath. Below, a single street wound between broken buildings toward the river, its cobbles still wet from last night's rain. Around him, the church clock kept a patient, indifferent time. To most men, that tower was a ruin. To him, it was a command post, a transmission hub, an instrument of death. He drew a thin pencil across the coordinates in his little notebook, felt the old numbers like teeth, and then spoke into the radio with the calm certainty of a man who had made his peace with arithmetic and consequence. "Battery, this is Observer 1. Target is confirmed. Grid reference 3287. Bearing 185. Wind 3 knots west. Request fire mission. M1 battery, HE with time fuse. Spotters ready." That was the work of a forward observer, FO, to be the eye that turned the barrel of a distant gun into an extension of the battlefield's will. Not every army had the same name for him. Artillery liaison, spotter, observer. The role was ancient in concept, but precise in craft. Where infantry engaged and tanks struck, an FO calculated, coaxed, and sometimes begged the heavens into compliance. In Normandy, where the grid of hedgerows and narrow lanes made front lines into a clutter of ambushes, the FO was a force multiplier, small, dangerous, and hated by commanders who had been on the receiving end of his math. Most forward observers were a strange fusion of temperaments. They needed the patience of astronomers and the appetite for risk of scouts. They had to read not only a map, but the geometry of buildings, the angle of a roof, the resilience of a bridge pier, how a factory's boiler room would cough when a shock wave passed through. They learned to convert sight into decimal degrees and degree into carnage. Their notebook, heavy with corrections, angles, and wind calls, became as sacred as an infantryman's rifle. They were trained to calculate the fall of shot on paper before the first shell screamed out of the muzzle, to translate a human object, a steam plant, a depot, a mayor's office, into a coordinate, and then into a sequence of explosions designed not just to wound, but to cripple the enemy's ability to command and move. Training made them technicians of ruin. They learned meteorology to the degree a farmer knows rain, how a river valley channeled gusts, how heat shimmered an aiming point, how humidity altered the burn rate of a fuse. They learned optics, the way parallax could lie, the way a stone chimney could hide a radio room. They practiced trigonometry until the numbers were muscle memory, practiced voice discipline over radio until the click of a microphone became their heartbeat. Most importantly, they learned the language of artillery, how to speak in ranges, corrections, and the clipped, almost religious formula of spot, correct, fire for effect. Under fire, everything had to be clean. No wasted syllables, no hesitations. Hesitation killed. But the FO was not just a mathematician. He was a chess player who preferred the dark squares. He did not merely hit things, he chose which things to hit. A long tom, an M1 155mm, was a great weapon, a leviathan of the field artillery world capable of raining destruction over miles. Yet in the hands of an FO, it could become surgical. The FO decided when precision mattered more than brute force. He selected targets because they were nodes, the depot whose loss would strand a division of trucks, the electrical substations whose blackout would mute an entire industrial quarter, the headquarters where the enemy staff still believed themselves safely ensconced. Destroy the node, and you paralyze the net. Observation was as much about moral geometry as it was mathematical. The FO in that tower in Normandy had to imagine the blast, forecast the spread of fire, and measure the cost. He was acutely aware that behind every target there might be civilians, that a miscalculated fuse could turn a tactical victory into an atrocity. That awareness did not stop him from ordering shells.
Often it made the orders more surgical, the fuse settings longer, the ripple of fire more controlled. He carried the weight of that choice in his voice. "Adjust left 20, he would say into the microphone, clinical, but with the tremor of a man who had counted the human cost and chosen to accept it for a larger end. Attachment to a battery was a relationship of trust and cadence. An FO relied on the crew's discipline, the fuse setter's steadiness, the loader's rhythm, the gunner's respect for the weather report he'd given from a wind-whipped tower. In return, artillerymen trusted the FO to read reality where they could not. The battery far behind the lines, its long muzzles and sleeping crews, depended on his numbers to make sure they did not waste gold-toned shells on empty fields, or worse, on their own troops. That trust was built in repetitions: spot round, correction, second round, adjustment. Each correction was a negotiation between what the FO saw and what the gun did. Sometimes the correction was small: left 20, add 200 meters. Sometimes it required a stubborn sequence of ranging shots until the target trembled under the pattern of exploding earth. In urban environments, the FO's craft reached an apex of complexity. Cities were layered: basements, cellars, attics, places where an unguided shell could do unpredictable business. The FO learned to fire for effect, not just to blow off a roof, but to sever supply lines, to collapse stairwells and deny movement, to set a factory's boiler room into a cascade of sparks and ruin. He called for timed and delayed fuses to detonate inside a structure, turning the weight of the building against itself. He ordered creeping barrages, artillery advancing just ahead of the infantry, like a slow, burning wall that forced defenders to abandon their positions. When the FO's voice synchronized with the battery's breath, a city could be stripped of its will to resist without the indiscriminate waste of endless bombardment. And yet there was more to him than the instrument. He was often a man who had walked the same streets he now ordered to be shattered, a man who knew the names of bakery owners and the layout of the town's hospital. That knowledge pressed on his choices like a thumb on a scale. The FO's journal, a cramped list of coordinates and hand-scrawled marginalia, would later read at once like a ledger and a confession. Target struck, hours of fire, collateral notes. He kept it because the battlefield demanded accounting. In quieter years, that notebook would be pressed to paper again as a memoir, a record of what one man with a glass in his hand had made possible. On that bell tower in Normandy, as dawn brightened and the radio breathed beneath him, he watched a convoy crawl toward the bridge. He felt the math resolve in his chest: wind, range, bearing, an equation that would soon be a sequence of detonations. He checked his fuses, called the battery's serial number into the ether, and then, with the same steady voice that had navigated nights of shell fire and the tremor of 100 corrections, he gave the order that would change a city's fate. Fire for effect. Below him, the town continued to be a town no longer. It had become a problem with edges. Above him, the battery readied its answer. And somewhere between the glass in his eye and the thunder that would answer, the FO lived out the paradox of his trade. A solitary man who could make a gun into a scalpel, who could turn metal, math, and judgment into the decisive instrument that made cities fall.
If the FO was the eye, the long tom was the hand. The long tom, the US 155mm M1 series, was less a single hammer than a toolbox. Heavy and solemn, yes, but capable of nuance when guided by skilled hands. To turn it from a blunt instrument into a city killer required more than brute force. It required choices of shell, of fuse, of angle, and of rhythm. That is what the FO negotiated for every mission. Which tool from the chest would produce the effect he wanted, and how the battery should sing it into being. On paper, the long tom is imposing: a wheeled carriage, a long tube, a crew trained to load, set fuses, and breathe in time with the gun. It could reach far,
In theater practice, its effective range is extended to the roads and ridges beyond visible sight, and its shells carried a punishing combination of blast and fragmentation. But an FO, thinking in urban terms, didn't care about the number alone. He cared about how that shell would meet a roof, a boiler room, or a magazine. Would it explode on impact? Would it bite through a roof and die in the rafters? Would it burst in air and spray a plaza with shrapnel or set a depot to torch? That calculus began with the choice of ammunition. Long toms could fire several types relevant to city work. A steel casing filled with explosive designed to break into lethal fragments. Use HE for demolition, for shattering masonry, for knocking out unarmored vehicles. But HE alone, detonating on contact, often scatters destruction outward rather than inward. For destroying an internal room or a magazine, it is sometimes inefficient. For a warehouse with a steel roof, or for hitting a munitions truck where you need penetration before blast, SAP could be the choice. WP shelled into a residential or industrial quarter could create a choking pall of smoke to screen troop movement, or set wooden roofs and fuel stores ablazing. It is a cruel tool. Its effect is both tactical and terrifying. A delay fuse let the shell bury itself in a structure and detonate inside, shock traveling through beams and supports, tearing the building from within. In urban sabotage, delayed blasts are far more surgical than surface detonations. An FO's call always began by asking what effect the commander truly wanted. To deny an enemy his headquarters, you might not need to flatten the whole building. You needed to sever the communication stack, blast the dispatch room, and render stairwells unusable. For that, the FO chose a mixed sequence, ranging HE splashes to find the deck, a pair of SAP to ping the steel frames, and then a delayed HE into the roof to explode into the offices below. If the target was a supply yard, a few WP rounds could ignite fuel and spread fire across flammable cargoes, while HE rounds finished wrecked material into twisted scrap. Commerce destroyed, movement halted. Ballistics and the arc of approach were equally important. The long tom could lob shells in high, looping trajectories. Higher angles of fire meant steeper angles of fall. The difference between a shell striking a facade and a shell plunging nearly vertically onto a roof. In cities where buildings were closely packed, that steep fall could bypass exterior defenses to strike the soft underbelly of an industrial block. The FO would deliberately order higher elevation when the objective demanded internal damage. Increase elevation to 43 degrees, use delay fuses, SAP for the second shot. That command was geometry translated into violence. Coordination with the battery turned these choices into sequences. A standard urban mission unfolded in stages. First came the spotting rounds, isolated shells to check the aiming and the wind. The FO watched impacts with glass and called corrections. Left 5, add 60, drop 30. A few spot corrections later, the FO would issue the order, fire for effect, unleashing the planned pattern. Timed bursts, tuned to the structure's rhythm. There was technique in the timing. A ripple of 3 rounds, spaced seconds apart, could progressively fracture a support beam. A short, intense salvo could create simultaneous shocks that set a roof to sag and then collapse. More advanced tactics layered effects. A creeping barrage adapted for urban use could drive defenders from windows and rooftops, while infantry closed in. A coordinated WP screen could blind sentries and force units into covered areas, where HE delayed rounds would do their most savage work. The FO also thought in cycles. Strike a communications hub at 2 a.m. to cut phone lines, hit supply depots at 3 a.m. to prevent resupply, and then crater a road at dawn to trap the enemy's mobility. Fire became choreography rather than mere destruction. Weather and urban topology shaped every decision. Wind could carry WP smoke unpredictably, sending choking clouds into neutral neighborhoods. Humidity affected fuse burn rates. Narrow alleys created echoes that made localizing impacts difficult. Even the color of a roof, lead-coated versus tile, altered penetration. FO math was lived knowledge. A shell that buried 3 feet into clay would perform differently than one slamming into reinforced concrete. He would ask, "What do we want to break first?" and then pick the tool to make that happen. There were limits and moral calculations. Deliberate attacks on purely civilian structures were barred in doctrine, though war always skirts such rules. The FO often had to prove his target's military value. The building smoked diesel, ferried troops, or housed a command post. He needed corroboration, aerial photos, partisan tips, intercepted radio traffic before he signed off on the order. He knew the cost of being wrong: civilian lives, political fallout, and the ghostly burden that followed every misjudged mission. Finally, there was the human rhythm of the battery itself. The Long Tom's crew had procedures: the breach hand, the fuse setter, the loader, and a cadence of discipline. In the dark, with the FO's voice cold in their ear, they set fuses to the millisecond, checked elevation, and braced for recoil. The gun's recoil punched the earth in a familiar way. The crew read the pattern of returns like a poem. A well-run battery could convert the FO's minute directives into devastating sequences in under a minute, and that speed often decided whether a bridge fell before reinforcements arrived or a command post withstood a final relief. So the FO did not merely choose a shell. He chose a story for that city: how it would be wounded, where it would burn, and which arteries would be closed. In Normandy, that story meant saving lives in the longer view, stopping convoys, severing communications, and breaking the will to resist. But it also meant weighing the terrible calculus of urban bombardment. The Long Tom gave him options. The choice of which one to use was his burden, and, in the theater of towns and bridges and smoke, his art.
The night the mission began, Normandy smelled of wet earth and diesel, a scent that clung like a promise. The town the patrol called Saint-Léon sat in a shallow basin, its streets a narrow tangle that fed to a river, and, beyond that, a small railway depot that the Germans had pressed into service as a local command hub. Intelligence had been blunt: intercepted orders, a partisan report, and aerial photos showing trucks moving in at dusk and out at dawn. The FO, Lieutenant James Halverson, 29, steady hands, old eyes behind an ever-waiting scope, had watched that depot for 3 days. He had seen the rhythm: 2 trucks at 0200, a staff car at 0300, radio transmissions at intervals. It was small, perfectly nondescript, and exactly the sort of anatomical node that could choke a battalion if severed. He made his call at 0112. Battery, this is Observer 3. Target is the depot and adjacent command post. Grid 427713. Request 3 ranging, then fire for effect. M1 battery, HE delayed on effect 1. WP for screening on effect 2. Time window 0200 to 0330. Confirm? Static crackled, then the poised voice of the battery captain. Observer 3, Battery B copies. Preparing spot grounds. Over. The operation unfolded like clockwork, and like violence. Halverson left nothing to chance. He requested 2 reconnaissance passes by a liaison pilot the afternoon before and cross-checked roof lines against a partisan sketch. He crawled the rooftops at dusk with a signalman to verify bearings. He knew where civilians might seek shelter, knew where the hospital's auxiliary ward lay. That knowledge shaped everything: when to fire, what to detonate, and how to force the enemy out with minimal civilian exposure. "We do this right," he told his small team. "We end their command chain without setting the whole town on fire." He did not say the other truth, that right was a narrow margin, and the margin could fail. At 0145, the first spot rounds came over, green slashes of tracer into the black. They were deliberate, single shells, tested to find the arc. Halverson watched each impact through his glass, calling corrections: drop 40, left 25. The battery replied with mechanical efficiency. Each adjustment was a tiny argument about wind and weight, a negotiation of physics across miles. The first rounds punched into the depot's yard, raising curtains of dust that smelled faintly of diesel. A dog barked somewhere below. A window rattled.
Spotting, this grinding, patient business, was the FO's meditation. When the second spotting salvo landed precisely where he needed, Halverson let himself exhale. He keyed the radio with a voice made of thin steel. Fire for effect. Wave 1, 3 HE delayed into the southern roofline and central office. Wave 2, 2 WP into the service yard to both mark and create smoke. Wave 3, ripple HE to crater the access road. Effect, battery effect. When the first effect struck, the night tore open. The HE delayed rounds, they were chosen for the way they could bury themselves in timber and burst inward, found their mark. A warehouse roof exploded inward, timbers collapsing like ribs. The central office, thought to house dispatch and radios, shuddered as a delayed burst tore through its second story. Inside, report books and wires became incandescent. Men who had been scribbling orders a minute ago were thrown to the floor by concussive force, and the radio went dead. The depot became a room with no voice. Halverson listened for the secondary sounds, the crackle of splintering wood, an engine dying in the river of smoke, a shout that might be a man or might be a gear. He waited for confirmation. "Target quiet," whispered his signaler when the cries stilled. He ordered the second wave WP, knowing well the terror WP could spread. Its white trails blossomed as they struck the service yard, a choking fog that moved with the wind over parked trucks, searing paint and igniting fuel. Guards fled from portholes of light into the haze, coughing, blinded and disoriented. The smoke did what bullets rarely could. It stripped the enemy's vision and turned the depot into a maze of panic. Then came the ripple. The battery unleashed a measured cascade of HE shells aimed along the supply road that fed the depot. Each impact came in a timed sequence, cratering the asphalt, halting the trucks that had not yet left. One lorry tried to reverse and became a pyre when a tracer found its fuel drum. The railway sidings, once humming with the dull promise of movement, were choked with twisted metal and smoldering timbers. The ripple effect did more than destroy materiel. It rewired the enemy's choices. Trains rerouted through longer paths. Trucks spent days in detours too narrow for full convoys. Halverson's geometry had moved beyond a single building. He had carved a wound into the enemy's supply system. But precision does not guarantee innocence. As the aftermath settled and the glow from burning engines painted the low clouds orange, cries rose from the town's eastern quarter. A misfired round, or perhaps a ricochet from a collapsing wall, had landed in a civilian bakery. Halverson heard the report on the radio, felt the weight of it like a physical blow. He had ordered the window deliberately narrow to avoid such risks. Still, the urban environment answers unpredictably to metal and fire. He dispatched a runner to check casualties, and at dawn he recorded the small, unbearable truth in his notebook. 2 civilians killed, 5 wounded. The entry was clinical, a line of ink that would haunt him for years. Military reports framed the mission as a success. The depot was neutralized, command disrupted, and supplies destroyed, and the entire sector's ability to coordinate counterattacks degraded for days. Soldiers in forward positions found that morning that enemy patrols were thinner, radios were silent, and rearguard movements were strangled. Tactically, it was a masterstroke, an FO's ideal realized. Strategically, it changed the tempo of operations in the region, allowing an infantry push to consolidate before German reinforcements could be mustered. Yet Halverson could not uncouple the calculus of victory from the casualties he had noted. In the privacy of the bell tower, after the smoke thinned and the sirens faded, he crossed out the entry, rewrote it in denser ink, and wrote beneath it, "We saved more lives than we cost. This is why the depot had to fall." It was a rationale, but not a balm. The paradox was the FO's burden, the knowledge that by destroying a node, he had shortened one man's life and possibly spared dozens. He slept, fitfully, with the radio at his side and the taste of diesel in his mouth. The operation had been surgical because it had been chosen and choreographed. It worked because observation met calculation, and because the battery trusted the spotter's call. In the euphoric reports, Halverson's name was a line among many. In the memory of the small town, the depot was the night that changed everything. For Halverson, it was the evening that taught him the exact measure of consequence: how high to aim a shell, how long to set a fuse, and how to live with the echoes of a city he had helped to bend to the will of strategy.
By dawn, St. Leon was a bruise on the landscape. The river carried a slick of oil and ash, and every breath tasted faintly of phosphorus. From the bell tower, Lieutenant Halverson could see the skeleton of the rail depot still smoldering, the tracks twisted into blackened ribbons. The strike had done exactly what it was meant to do: cripple logistics, silence the German command net, and stall reinforcements heading to the coast. But it had done more than that. In the silence between transmissions, he could hear the sound of something that was not war: the cry of a child, the bark of a dog that had survived the night, the ringing of a church bell struck not by intention, but by shockwaves. It was the sound of the living inside the ruins. No manual had ever prepared an FO for that. The field manual spoke of precision fire, of calculated zones of lethality, but they did not speak of what it meant to watch a city's heart stutter beneath your own coordinates. Halverson's job was to measure angles, range, effect. But what he had no measure for was grief. He had known abstractly that urban bombardment was never clean. Every round that struck perfectly still sent shards of fate in random directions. A delayed fuse shell that performed flawlessly could collapse a warehouse, yet send one brick flying across the street into a home. The FO's duty was to minimize, never to eliminate. That morning, as the first civilian survivors came stumbling from cellars with soot on their faces, he realized that minimize was a word for people far from the smoke. At 0800, a medical sergeant brought the report. The bakery had been struck by a fragment from the second wave. The family inside: 2 dead, 5 wounded. The sergeant's voice was steady, but his hands trembled as he handed the paper over. Halverson signed it, knowing it would join the official record, then folded it into his pocket instead of his dispatch folder. It stayed there all through the next rotation, the corner softening with sweat and time. War rewarded results, not reflection. That same afternoon, headquarters sent commendations. The strike on St. Leon was listed as one of the most efficient urban artillery operations of the Normandy campaign. Minimal shells, maximum disruption, precise execution. The Army historian who would later compile the division's record described it as a textbook demonstration of combined observation and indirect fire. For Halverson's battery, it was a victory. For him, it was a knot that wouldn't untie. That night, when the radio went quiet and the crew lay asleep around the guns, he walked to the edge of the battery perimeter where the sound of waves mixed with the distant hum of a burning town. He had been taught to see cities as maps, grids, sectors, coordinates. Now he saw them as organisms, and he realized what he had done was not just amputate a limb of the German war machine. He had wounded something living, something that might never heal cleanly again. In the following days, word spread among locals. They called it La Nuit du Feu Blanc, the night of white fire. To the soldiers, that sounded almost poetic. To the people who lived it, it was horror turned into folklore. When Allied engineers entered the town to rebuild the bridge, children stared at the American uniforms with a mixture of awe and fear. An old woman touched Halverson's sleeve and murmured in French, "You burned them so that they would not burn us, yes?" He didn't answer. He couldn't, because in that simple question was everything the FO's craft contained: necessity and guilt, protection and destruction, all tangled in the same smoke. There was an understanding that spread among observers across the front, a silent fraternity of men who had seen what their coordinates could do. They learned to argue for restraint. Some refused to call certain missions if they could not confirm the target's nature. Others found ways to shape their reports to delay or divert unnecessary strikes. Halverson became one of them. His next missions were still effective, but they carried an edge of mercy. Orders to fire short, to use WP only as screening, to select night timings when civilians were indoors. He knew this changed little in the grand arithmetic of war, but it let him breathe. In his notebook, between lines of bearings and elevations, he began writing short notes, not about tactics, but about what the targets looked like before they vanished. Red shutters, he wrote once. Laundry still on the line. Dog chained outside. It wasn't sentimentality. It was proof that the world still existed beyond the crosshairs, that destruction wasn't the whole of seeing. Every FO who lived long enough learned that war had two sets of eyes, one that looked through the scope and another that watched from memory. The first was technical, unblinking, accurate. The second never forgot what the first had chosen to ignore. Halverson's eyes had begun to merge into one, an unbearable fusion of precision and regret. On the sixth night after the strike, the rain came. It hissed through the cracks of the bell tower and dripped through the open roof, washing soot from the stones. The fire at the depot finally died. From his observation post, he could see soldiers moving again in the town square. American engineers, French villagers. They looked impossibly small against the ruin. He picked up the radio out of habit, whispering into the static. Fire mission completed. Then, more softly, to no one, and what have we learned? He didn't know the answer then. None of them did. The FO was never meant to ask moral questions. His was a trade of numbers and distances, but Normandy's cities had forced those questions upon him. Each coordinate was now a choice not only of where a shell would fall, but what kind of man he would be after it landed. In the years that followed, soldiers would call their strikes surgical, precise, controlled. The words would change, but the ache behind them would not. Halverson would carry the sound of St. Leon for the rest of his life, the whine of descending shells, the crack of masonry, and somewhere beneath it, the whisper of a city that had learned what it meant to be saved by being destroyed. He had turned the long tom into a scalpel, yes, but even a scalpel leaves scars.
The guns fell silent long before Halverson's conscience ever did. When the campaign in Normandy ended, the maps were redrawn, the reports filed, and the medals pinned. The long toms moved north toward Belgium, their barrels cleaned and painted, their crews proud. In every official sense, the system had worked. The coordination between forward observers and batteries had rewritten the tempo of modern war. But for the men who had called the fire, there remained one unanswered question. At what point does precision stop being mercy and become mastery over life itself? The strike at St. Leon became a case study in efficiency. In post-action analysis, instructors at Fort Sill and the Army Field Artillery School used it to teach applied observation doctrine. They praised the clean fire pattern, the controlled escalation, the coordination between FO and battery. They even admired the economy of munitions, fewer than 50 rounds to neutralize a major target and sever the railway artery. A triumph of calculated gunnery, one report read. The line beneath it was smaller, colder. Collateral damage, acceptable. To the next generation of officers, that phrase became a formula. To Halverson, it was a scar. He was transferred to another sector before Christmas 1944, a veteran FO whose cool precision had earned quiet respect. His new assignment placed him at the edge of the Ardennes, where his calls once again guided the heavy guns that would later crush the German counteroffensive. He did his duty as always, his tone steady, his reports flawless. But his spotter notebook had changed. Between coordinate lines, he continued to write observations not meant for any superior. Children carried buckets from the river. Smoke drifted wrong way, houses caught. Never forget, every correction touches someone. War, he realized, had evolved into a contest of calculation. The long time had made that evolution possible. Where once armies relied on brute artillery saturation, now they spoke of targeted destruction, the art of cutting nerves instead of breaking bones. It was a doctrine that made commanders giddy with control. It gave them the illusion that war could be managed like engineering, that enough math could keep blood neat. The FO knew better. Precision did not make killing clean. It only made it quieter, easier to justify. Still, he couldn't deny the weapon's genius. The long-time's legacy was undeniable. It had given Allied forces the reach to hit what no other field gun could, to cripple bridges, airfields, and depots beyond the horizon. It had forced German armor to disperse, to fight blind. Its shells, when guided by men like Halvorsen, had rewritten the language of coordination: observer, radio, battery, impact, report. Each syllable was a link in a chain of destruction so tight that no gap could be called chance. In a strange way, it was beautiful, the way a machine becomes poetry when it obeys the will of thought. After the war, Halvorsen was invited to lecture at the artillery school. He stood before a classroom of young officers, chalk in hand, and drew the familiar triangle: gun, target, observer. Beneath it, he wrote 3 words: range, bearing, judgment. 2 of these you can learn. The 3rd you will spend your life wrestling with. They laughed politely, thinking it was humor. He did not laugh. He taught them how to read wind and rubble, how to spot reflections on wet stone that betrayed fuel depots, how to trust their instinct over static in the radio. But he also told them this: a perfect shot is not one that hits, it's one that you are right to call. Few wrote that down. Doctrine preferred certainty, not conscience. When Halvorsen finally returned home to Wisconsin, the war followed him like smoke in his coat. He kept his binoculars on a shelf, his logbook in a drawer, and his uniform folded under glass. He married, raised 2 sons, and worked as a surveyor, measuring land instead of killing it. Yet, every spring when the rains came, he would dream of St. Leon, of coordinates whispered into static, of the city turning orange in the dark, of the line he had drawn on the map that divided safety from annihilation. In 1964, long after his hair had turned gray, he was invited to a reunion in Normandy. The town had rebuilt: new bridges, new depot, new faces. The French mayor greeted the veterans warmly, thanking them for liberation. During a small ceremony, Halvorsen wandered to the edge of the rebuilt rail yard. Children played near the tracks where he had once watched trucks burn. He could still see, in memory, the outlines of the old warehouse, the one his first delayed round had torn apart. He pulled from his pocket a folded photograph, a black and white aerial image of the 1944 strike marked with the thin pencil lines of his targeting arcs. He stood for a long time, the wind riffling the corners, then let the photo fall into the grass. He whispered something, half prayer, half confession. The city stood again. That's enough. In later years, military historians called men like him the mathematicians of destruction. It was meant as praise, but for Halvorsen, the word that fit better was custodian. He hadn't just calculated impacts. He had held in his mind the balance between need and loss, precision and pity. The long time had made him powerful, but it had also made him responsible. That was the final lesson. The future of war would always chase precision, guided shells, radar locks, satellites, and digital maps, but the soul of the FO's craft would never change. The weapon, no matter how advanced, was only as moral as the man behind the glass. Every coordinate remained a choice, every correction a confession. In the end, Lieutenant Halvorsen's story was not about a gun that could level a city, but about a man who learned that the ability to destroy carries a greater duty: to remember what should never be erased. The long time's thunder faded long ago, its barrels cold in museums. But somewhere in the grainy silence of a veteran's memory, the radio still crackles, and a calm, careful voice whispers into eternity. Target confirmed. A just left 20. Fire for effect. And may it be the last time we ever need to.